Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents The Wall, Rome's Greatest Frontier, by Alistair Moffat, narrated by James Cameron Stewart. Preface. There is something about barricades, high ramparts overlooking long vistas, crenellated walkways patrolled by watchful soldiers, strong towers, formidable castles. Perhaps the attraction comes from years of television and film, American Indians charging across the plains, whooping and yelling, hurtling towards camera, loosing off arrows at the good guys safe behind the stockade, or baddies assaulting the walls of mighty castles, while desperate defenders hurl everything and anything that comes to hand. Feeling safe inside from danger outside, probably a primitive instinct lurking in the shadows of many a subconscious. Ramparts are attractive, and surely none more than Hadrian's Wall. There is nothing else remotely like it west of China, nothing bigger, grander, more masterful, and more impressive. Standing on the wind sill at Housted's fort, looking over the northern moorland, perhaps scanning the horizon for a flicker of movement, or up at Walltown Crags, where the wall glowers over grey Thirlwall Common, there is a sense of borrowed authority, of let them come, or, to paraphrase a little, let them gaze upon my works and despair. Even though it nowhere rises to its original height, and long stretches of it have disappeared, power pulses from Hadrian's Wall. Built by a culture galvanized by the will of one man, it is a miracle of self-aggrandizement and ancient disregard for practicalities. A mighty wall which divides our island, devised by conquerors to limit their empire, it somehow still manages to play to the little boy and his toy soldiers in an imagined landscape. Although it never marked a cultural frontier, or the line along which the border between England and Scotland would eventually run, Hadrian's Wall nevertheless had an important early role in creating an idea of the north of Britain. For almost 3 centuries, savagery and danger lay beyond it. The north was threatening, while the south was sunlit, civilized, sophisticated. It is impossible to say when or how these notions came into play, but they are there as surely as the wall. And its story is fascinating. Very little in what follows is original, and much depends on the superb corpus of research and archaeology produced in the last 60 years. But there are differences of emphasis. The native British story of Hadrian's Wall cannot be easily told. Neither the archaeology nor written sources exist in any quantity. Such records as do are gossamer scant, mostly illusory or opaque. But an attempt must be made. How the native peoples treated the wall and its builders and garrison is a vitally important component, too often relegated to the background, only faintly heard as mood music behind the onward march of the legions. After all, the native kings and their warriors had a motive role in persuading Hadrian to build a wall, and not just any barrier, but a truly monumental solution to a serious military problem. The following pages attempt to find more of a role for the British, the ancestors of many of most of us. Another difference in emphasis is prompted by the remarkable letters and lists found at the fort at Vindolanda, which lies a kilometre or so to the south of the central sector of the wall. These unique records predate the arrival of Hadrian and his builders in AD 122 by 20 years, but they shine a brilliant light on the everyday lives of the Roman garrison in the north, and even occasionally have something to say about the natives. The Vindolanda letters and lists insist on a central place in any understanding of Hadrian's Wall. Roman actions and attitudes are comparatively well documented and are rehearsed at some length at the beginning of the book. The where and the why of Hadrian's Wall is much better understood by building a detailed context, and a long preamble attempts that, beginning with the first contacts through Julius Caesar and his expeditions of 55 BC and 54 BC, and leading up to the invasion of the north under Agricola more than a century later. Caesar is the most famous Roman of them all, and even over 2 millennia his dash and bravery is unmistakable. He begins the story of the wall. Along the way, the text contains many items of information which seemed interesting, even important in themselves, but did not necessarily fit into the narrative. They can be considered asides, ignored, or heard at end of each chapter. The last chapter is also not part of the narrative. Having spent a lot of time on Hadrian's Wall during the writing and research for this book, and knowing it reasonably well, it occurred to me that an itinerary taking in the places I enjoyed most might be more helpful than an exhaustive list of internet addresses and opening times. Others will have different views, but I found the visits to the places set out in the last chapter very pleasurable. As I was finishing this book in December 2007, my father-in-law, Malcolm Thomas, died. He had been a regular soldier, a man with many old-fashioned virtues and few old-fashioned opinions. Caulfield's Mile Castle would have made him smile with recognition of its daftness, and the whole enterprise of building and garrisoning the wall would have prompted perceptive and informed comments. I am sorry not to have them, and out of the greatest respect and affection, this book is dedicated to his memory. 1. Caesar, Claudius, and the Elephants. It was midnight before the wind turned. All day the soldiers of the 7th and the 10th Legions had been embarking onto the transport ships. Only 80 were assembled in the harbour at Boulogne, and more than 100 men in full armour, carrying all their weapons and kit, had been crammed onto the decks of each ship. Legionaries were much happier tramping the metalled roads of the fast-expanding Roman Empire, and may well have been apprehensive as their heavily laden ships bobbed at anchor, waiting for the entire expedition to be ready to sail. They faced a journey into the unknown, a voyage across the ocean, a real danger of being swept out into the vastness of the open sea. As evening approached and a waxing moon rose in the sky, the sea captains at last made ready and hoisted sails to catch the freshening wind. It should, blow the invasion fleet on a northwesterly course across the Channel. In the moonshine, lookouts hoped soon to make out the white cliffs of Britannia, luminous in the summer dark, and use them as a sea mark to guide their steersmen. The late August of 55 BC, the 25th, was indeed late to be mounting such an audacious expedition, but Julius Caesar was indeed an audacious general. Most of the staff officers and their daring commander sailed on warships, and they led the fleet out of the safety of Boulogne and the calm estuary of the River Liane. Powered by banks of oars, they depended a little less on the vagaries of the elements than the 18 transports which had been allocated the more awkward business of taking a force of 500 cavalrymen across the Channel. Their embarkation had been delayed, and in order to catch up, the troopers rode north, up the coast road to Ambleteuse, where they again failed to embark and join the main fleet. The wind and the tide had turned against them. Caesar pressed on, and by dawn his lookouts will have seen the ghostly shapes of the white cliffs looming out of the grey light. From East Weir Bay and around the blunt headland at South Foreland, the high chalk cliffs were often sailors' first sight of Britain. By mid-morning, the little harbour at Dover had come into view. But there was no possibility of a landing. Strung out along the cliffs overlooking the harbour were thousands of British warriors. Battle horns blaring, weapons rattling against their shields, chariots drawn up, the war bands of the southern kings had come to defend their island, roaring defiance across the waves. If Dover had indeed been his preferred destination, then Caesar will have been unpleasantly surprised. The massing of 2 legions and the gathering of an invasion fleet at Boulogne could have been no secret. When Caesar's plans had first become known in Britain, some native kings had sent ambassadors across the Channel. They pledged obedience to Rome and promised hostages to guarantee it. Commius, a king with some authority and influence in both Britain and northern Gaul, was dispatched back to Britain with the ambassadors and a brief to negotiate on Caesar's behalf. Peaceful submission was always preferable, cheaper, and almost as glorious as victory in war. It may have been Caesar's objective to visit Britain with an appropriate show of strength, accept promises of loyalty, and then leave without a blow being struck. But on arrival, Commius was immediately arrested and the detail of Rome's plans presumably extracted. When he saw the British kings and their warriors in battle order arrayed along the ramparts of the White Cliffs, Caesar may well have had to change those plans. Riding at anchor in the roadsteads off Dover, the Roman warships waited until the whole fleet had come together. The heavily laden transports had made slower headway. On board his flagship, Caesar held a council of war sometime in the early afternoon. In the weeks before the expedition sailed, he had sent Gaius Volusenus on a reconnaissance, his warship nosing along the Kentish coast looking for good landing sites. It seems that the Romans knew that the White Cliffs gave way to beaches northeast of Dover in Sandwich Bay. As the fleet weighed anchor and made for the new landing sites, the British army shadowed it up the coast. Somewhere near Deal, Caesar signalled his captains to steer straight and fast for the shore and run their warships up onto the beaches. They carried artillery, and arrows, slingshot, and crossbow bolts could be brought to bear on the British. When the troop transports attempted to rasp up onto the shore, their weight and deep draught prevented them from getting close enough. The seabed shelved away steeply into the channel, and fully armed legionaries were reluctant to jump into deep water. Their kit weighed them down, and they were forced to wade a long way before they could defend themselves from British missiles. Men who did risk the deep water were fighting their way ashore in small groups only, failing to form up into the disciplined close order which could be so effective on the battlefield. Humiliation stared hard at Caesar and his legions. And then, as sometimes happened in battle, an example of extraordinary individual bravery proved decisive. Here is Caesar's own account. And then, when our soldiers were still hanging back, mainly because of the depth of the water, the standard-bearer of the 10th offered up a quick prayer and then shouted out, "Jump down, soldiers, unless you want to give up your eagle to the enemy. Everyone will know that I at least did my duty to the Republic and my commander." After saying this in a loud voice, he jumped off the ship and began carrying the eagle standard towards the enemy. Then our soldiers called out to each other not to allow so terrible a disgrace as to lose the standard, and leapt down from the transport. When those on the nearby ships saw them, they followed and began to close with the enemy. In the long and narrow confines of the beach, the legionaries gradually formed a line and pushed forward. Behind the battle, watching from his warship, Caesar could see where his men needed reinforcements. Using rowing boats, he sent small detachments to wherever weak points threatened. Closing into a tight line, protected by their long, curved shields, thrusting with their short swords, the 7th and 10th legions gained control. Chasing the Roman fleet up the Channel coast to the beach landing had meant that most of the British infantry had been left behind, and their cavalry and charioteers were finding it difficult to match the well-armoured and disciplined ranks of the invaders. As the battle wore on, more and more men landed safely, and the British kings signalled a retreat. Not for the first time in this short campaign, Caesar was lucky. Although his attempts at preparatory diplomacy had failed badly, and Volusenus's reconnaissance seems to have been sadly deficient, Caesar's famous luck had held. But it was seen as more than luck by his soldiers. It was a sign of the gods' favour. Well-omened is a clumsy alternative meaning for the Latin felix, or lucky, but it conveys something of how it was understood. Luck did not come from nowhere. Once the beach had been cleared, Caesar's tactical instinct would have been to pursue the British inland and inflict as heavy a defeat as possible. Most casualties in battle came in the aftermath, when men were cut down as they fled. But the cavalry had still not arrived, and so Caesar was forced to secure only the immediate hinterland. Having fought long and hard, probably into the evening, the legionaries were forced to set to and build a marching camp on the beachhead to protect their position. Beyond the freshly dug ditches and ramparts, an unknown land stretched far to the north. From the Greek traveller Pythias of Massilia and other writers, the Romans knew that Britain was a large and long island, but it lay on the far side of the dangerous ocean, and as the legionaries lay down exhausted in their leather tents, they will have wondered what the morning would hold. In the middle of the 1st century BC, Britain was a shifting patchwork of small kingdoms, each with its own political interests and priorities. Rome seemed a colossus by comparison, a juggernaut which had rolled over the vast territory of Gaul. Some Britons had crossed the ocean to fight against Caesar's legions alongside their Gallic neighbours. Many knew that Rome was a world power capable of any action, no matter how merciless, in pursuit of its aims. Still more will have seen the empire as a golden opportunity. The trickle of luxury goods which had come into Britain from the Mediterranean spoke of wealth and glamour and a much wider world. For whatever reason, the British kings did not attack again. Instead, their envoys sought peace, promising hostages and freeing Commius, possibly in the hope that he might mediate. The British army, mostly levied from farms and settlements, melted back into the countryside, leaving the native kings with only their war bands and charioteers. 4 days after the battle on the beach, lookouts at last sighted the cavalry transports. 500 troopers would transform Caesar's options, but a storm blew down the channel and prevented the transports from landing, and a high tide had an even more devastating impact. It refloated the beached transports. Some smashed into each other and onto the shore, others were swept out to sea. Suddenly, Caesar's expedition found itself dangerously exposed. The legionaries had brought little in the way of supplies, and food was fast running out. They were stranded, unable to get off the island and back to the sanctuary of Gaul. Seeing at first hand all that happened, the British envoys in the Romans' camp stole away quietly to inform their kings that the gods were smiling. Forced to send out forage parties into the Kent countryside to find food, Caesar was in a very precarious position. But once again, luck and good soldiering came to the rescue. As the 7th Legion was harvesting fields of ripe wheat, a British ambush erupted out of nearby woods. The Romans, many of them armed only with sickles, were quickly surrounded by charioteers and cavalry. Very fortunately, a sharp-eyed lookout at a forward watchtower saw a cloud of dust rise in the distance in the direction the 7th Legion had gone. It was too much dust for marching men to make, and Caesar quickly realized what had happened. With a small troop of riders brought by Commius and his own men, he dashed to the rescue. With only 1,000 men, a potentially disastrous outcome was averted. But more trouble was coming. The British kings massed their host again and attacked the beachhead camp. The legions had time to form up in battle order outside the rampart, and in the close-quarter fighting which followed, the British were driven back and defeated. This time, Caesar did not delay. Most of the transports had been repaired, and the legions squeezed onto them and sailed back to Gaul. Hostages had been demanded, but Caesar did not wait for them to be delivered. September often saw bad weather in the Channel, and enough risks had already been taken to stretch the favour of the gods beyond breaking point. News of Caesar's expedition electrified public opinion in Rome. What had in reality been a lucky escape from near disaster became a propaganda triumph. Rome had reached out to the very ends of the earth. Her armies had crossed the dangers and mysteries of the ocean and subdued the savage primitives who lived at the edge of the world. The Senate rejoiced and voted 20 days of public thanksgiving, 5 more than for the much more significant conquest of Gaul. Caesar's many enemies were silenced. Marcus Porcius Cato embodied all of the stern old republican virtues of honour and fairness, while attacking what he saw as Caesar's wild ambition, a man who would be king, and his disregard for the law. He probably spoke against him in the same Senate meeting which voted for the Thanksgiving, and was probably drowned out by catcalls and insults. Pompey and Crassus, both rivals and immensely powerful and wealthy, had been elected consuls, the leading political offices in the Roman constitution, in 55 BC. But Caesar's coup in reaching Britain, as far from Rome as it seemed possible to be, eclipsed them. How they must have seethed amid the celebrations. The reaction to the expedition has much to say about the political atmosphere of the times. Britain began to occupy a special place in the collective imagination of Rome. Roman legions could march around the shores of the Mediterranean to the deserts of the east and north into the dark forests of Germany. But to reach across the ocean at the edge of the world, to land and defeat the warriors of Britain, showed Rome at her very boldest and mightiest. Nowhere and nothing was beyond her power. By the early years of the reign of Augustus, the first emperor and Julius Caesar's heir, the expansion of the empire had found divine support. The poet Virgil put these words in the mouth of Jupiter, Rome's supreme god. I set upon the Romans bounds neither of space nor of time. I have bestowed upon them empire without limit, to impose the ways of peace, to spare the defeated, and to crush those proud men who will not submit. All of this boundless, supposedly God-given ambition was founded on a remarkable phenomenon, the Roman army. One historian has characterized the history of the Republic and the Empire as the long, drawn-out, and ultimately unsuccessful process of political institutions attempting to keep pace with the extraordinary and continuing string of victories won by Rome's soldiers. They won because they were different. Every army that Rome faced in Western Europe and around the Mediterranean was largely recruited from amateurs, part-time soldiers with an obligation to fight when their aristocracy called upon them. Great hosts were mustered against the legions, often outnumbering them by many times, but they were comparatively poorly equipped, untrained, frightened farmers doing their duty. Rome's army was professional. Killing was its business. Its soldiers were well paid, well trained, well armed, and very experienced. When the 7th and 10th legions faced the war horns, the hail of insults, and the massed ranks of the British army in Kent in 55 BC, they will not have blinked. In Gaul and elsewhere, the legionaries had seen it all before. If they kept their discipline, remembered their training, and fought as a unit, they would cut these hollering savages to pieces, and almost always they did. It was the long drive for empire which forged the Roman army into a highly professional and deadly force. After Africa, Spain, Greece, and Asia Minor had been conquered, the urgent need for an efficient and permanent military capability was recognized by the great general Gaius Marius. In 107 BC, he was elected consul and immediately abolished the outdated property qualification needed to fight in the army. From landless men and his own supporters, Marius began recruiting full-time soldiers. Many signed up for 16 years, an unheard-of commitment, and in that time grew experienced and hardy. Training became mandatory, equipment better and standardized, and clear organization was imposed. Like all talented tacticians, Marius saw mobility as a key to victorious campaigning. From the moment they joined their units, Roman soldiers were trained to march. For 4 months, centurions put them through intensive square bashing so that they instinctively marched in step and reacted instantly to commands. In battle, this sort of collective conditioning could be crucial. To arrive at the battlefield quickly and in good order, recruits were put through a punishing schedule of route marching. Once trainee legionaries could march 30 kilometers in 5 hours, they were appalled to discover that they needed to maintain the same speed, but in full armor and carrying all their kit and equipment. On average, this weighed about 50 kilograms. Before Marius's reforms, the Roman army had been followed and slowed down by a baggage train of mules. After 107 BC, the legionaries carried everything and began to call themselves Marius's mules. Weaponry evolved and adapted at the same time. Most conscript armies, especially those raised amongst the Celtic peoples of Europe, used their large numbers in a simple but effective tactic, the furious charge. It worked for millennia, even after the introduction of muskets and cannons, and was last seen on British soil as late as 1746 at Culloden Moor. The Roman response was the javelin. Carried by each legionary, it had a long, slim, and very sharp point attached to a wooden haft. As the enemy ran within range, a dense volley was thrown. Javelins broke up a charge, but were not accurate enough to halt it. By the time survivors reached Roman battle lines, shields had locked together, and the short sword, known as the gladius, was drawn. No more than 60 centimeters long, it was much more effective in close-quarter fighting than the long, slashing sword used by Celtic warriors. Thrusting, stabbing, pushing, and staying together in a tight formation, the legions literally rolled over their enemies. Winning again and again, marching long distances quickly, Roman armies dominated Western European warfare for 500 years. As professional soldiers who trained, lived, fought, and died together, the legionaries developed a tremendously powerful esprit de corps. The sort of bravery shown by the standard-bearer of the 10th Legion on the Kentish beaches was by no means unusual. 3 years later, Caesar's men led an abortive attack in the Gaulish rebellion led by Vercingetorix. At Gergovia, they were forced to retreat downhill and could have suffered terrible casualties. But the centurions of the 7th and 10th Legions made a line and fought a brave rearguard action to allow their men down the slopes to safety. 46 centurions fell, but they prevented a disaster. Almost always the toughest soldiers in a legion and used to leading from the front, these men stood fast on the slopes at Gergovia, prepared to buy the safety of their comrades with their lives. After the Marian reforms, loyalty became an immensely powerful bond, but it was loyalty to their generals which mattered to soldiers far more than any loyalty to Rome itself. The state paid and equipped their legionaries, but crucially and catastrophically refused to make any provision for their discharge or retirement. Instead,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?